Welcome, colleagues. Please take a seat and we can get started here. My name is Joseph Majkut. I'm the Director of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program here at CSIS. It's my honor to welcome you here today. For those who are joining us in person, we're really happy to see you. And for those colleagues who are joining online, welcome to our digital programming as well. Just a brief interjection here at the start. This is a very safe building. If anything should happen, if an alarm goes off, what have you, just follow the instructions of a CSIS staff member or the well-lit exit signs. Today, we want to talk about one of the largest challenges facing our world, which is how are we actually going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Moreover, how are we going to do that in a way that helps us meet our climate goals? In the US, this is sometimes like a conversation you bury on a Thursday afternoon, right? So much of our focus is on our own domestic emissions, but the reality is 90% of global emissions now come from outside the United States. And we are, year over year, a diminishing portion of greenhouse gas emissions. So what is our strategy for addressing the other 90%? How do we give the US a strong role in global decarbonization? How do we make sure that the US participates in the value chains that enable global decarbonization? These are the kinds of questions we want to ask today. We're joined by a really esteemed panel, two people who are doing on the front edge of this on behalf of our government. And I'm happy to say my colleague, Erin Murphy, who is the Deputy Director of the Chair in Indian Studies and Emerging Asian Economies.
We just had a new name change, so we're all getting used to it. So.
Right. Erin has had a long career focused on these issues, formerly worked at the DFC, and she and I will be co-moderating today's discussion. Erin, thank you so much, and let's go ahead.
All right, hello everyone. As Joseph said, Erin Murphy. I'm with the Chair on India and Emerging Asia Economies or Economics. We're still not quite sure there, but we're going to figure that out. But Joseph has raised these big questions, and I think with this week, with the World Bank meetings, climate has been top of mind for policymakers, for those that are moving money through multilateral development banks, and also trying to push the private sector in being able to innovate and find new ways to tackle this issue, especially when it comes to emissions and decarbonization. But this can't just happen alone, and usually you need policymakers behind it and money behind it. And so, of course, we have two folks from the U.S. government that are going to be talking to us today about that. They're at the tip of the spear of this policy. So we're joined by Narayan Subramanian, who's the Director for Energy Transition at the White House National Security Council. We're also joined by Omar Ben Halim, who's the Acting Deputy Chief Climate Officer at the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, or the DFC. So, Narayan, if I can ask you just to open up with a couple of minutes of remarks.
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much, CSIS, for hosting this, and particularly this topic, which is front of mind for a lot of folks, especially as we're heading into another COP. Also, just general anxiety out there of what's going to happen with our emissions trend. As I was walking here, I just saw another UN report that came out about our emissions trajectory. So there's generally this question of where are we with regard to our 1.5 degrees Celsius net zero trajectory, and also what policies are in place currently, both in the US and abroad, that are driving us towards that trajectory. What's the delta between where we are and where we need to be? And so that question is very much front of mind for everyone. It has been for the last couple of years since the Biden-Harris administration came in. Of course, in the last couple of years, we've had a sweep of legislative activity, starting with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and then later the Inflation Reduction Act. We're just coming off the 2-year anniversary of the Inflation Reduction Act. So we're right at this point right now where we can kind of take stock of what's happened just in the last 3 years since the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law passed. I think we're just on the cusp of the 3-year anniversary of that. And so between the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, we as the United States have made or committed to make historic investments over a 10-year or so period, and perhaps beyond that, into various clean energy supply chains and also supporting clean energy deployment at large in the United States. Now, this has a couple of effects. One is within the U.S. itself. It's driving decarbonization across various sectors, across transportation, across the industrial sector, of course, the power sector as well. But this is also having very obvious spillover effects to other countries. For one, it's long-term going to lower global technology costs for various clean energy technologies. But the other thing that we're also observing is since the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act passed, there has been a proliferation of, so to speak, clean energy industrial policies across the world, right? So in Europe, you have the Net Zero Industry Act. Just after the recent European Commission election, the president, in her inaugural address, pretty much said, expect more of this. We're going to be doing more clean energy industrial policy. Similarly, Japan has the Green Transformation Policy. India has the suite of production-linked incentive schemes. Brazil has the Nova Industria. Australia's put out a Future Made in Australia plan. The list goes on and on and on. And it's no coincidence, right? I'm sure there would be some form of clean energy industrial policies even if the BIL and IRA didn't exist, but it's pretty clear that they did set off an arms race of sorts when it comes to clean energy industrial policy. And why is that the case? A couple of reasons. One is I think the BIL and IRA really laid the marker that there are good political economy benefits of doing clean energy policy this way, that actually investing in the economy, making this a worker and community-centered transition helps really build the domestic case for clean energy. And that is having spillover effects in terms of policy that other countries are pursuing, right? Brazil's Nova Industria is very similarly framed. Even Australia's Future Made in Australia plan, which hasn't gone into effect yet or been passed in Parliament yet, is also using a similar framing. Canada, I also neglected to mention Canada. So there's so many other countries out there that are doing this. I also want to note that if you go back and look at some of the rhetoric, the official rhetoric coming from countries, particularly the G7, back in 2023, the G7 released a Clean Energy Economy Action Plan, which is this collective statement among G7 countries. It's actually a phenomenal statement. I recommend everyone go look at it because it pretty much plants the flag saying that the way to do clean energy policy and the way to get to a net zero emissions trajectory is to bring all developing countries along and recognize the fact that what we, the G7, are doing is not going to be enough. We're going to have to bring down global clean energy technology costs, but we're also going to have to bring the developing world along with us. And how are we going to do that? Well, one, by making the MDBs and our DFIs more accessible. Two, making sure we can actually figure out where in global clean energy supply chains there are real gaps that developing countries can fit into. So this is not just, an extractive industry that we're going to set up in developing countries, but really thinking about local beneficiation across the world and figuring out where different countries fit in the value chain. One of the explicit sentences in that statement is developing countries need to be part of this conversation. And that is already happening. You're seeing that conversation happening among the G20 already, led by Brazil. And what's particularly exciting about this moment is the fact that Brazil, as the G20 president right now, is going to become the COP30 president next year. And next year is also the year that the new round of nationally determined contributions are going to be coming out. So there's real momentum here that if we can kind of carry this message forward via the G20, this can become something that we are also able to land at COP30, recognizing that every country is going to have to raise ambition, and the way they can do it is really investing in their own economies. So the role of the United States and the G7 at large is to continue doing what we're doing, expand what we're doing, but also make it more accessible to other countries. The last point I want to make on this is on the heels of the IRA passing, there were a lot of concerns from allies and partners about, are there protectionist effects or impacts? And there was a lot of trade conversations. What's becoming increasingly clear via IRA implementation is the IRA really creates firm demand pulls and demand signals for other countries to invest in their own clean energy supply chains. And just this morning, the Treasury Department announced an update to the 45X manufacturing tax credit rule. And in that rule, in the final rule, they now account for indirect and direct material costs as being counted as part of the 10% production tax credit for critical minerals processing and also electro and active material manufacturing. So what that means is that even if one purchases material from abroad, that material that goes into a U.S. product that's substantially transformed in the U.S. can be credited as part of that tax credit. That's a huge, huge change. This is something that has come up in conversations at roundtables that CSIS has hosted. I vividly remember this, and Joe, you were there as well. So this is exciting. This is a moment when the IRA is really in effect. It's moving along. We have a lot more work to do, but we're already really seeing the effects, the spillover effects. Thank you.
So we have these key pieces of legislation that are striking its ambition. You've laid out that other countries are pursuing other types of industrial policies around decarbonization and environmental action. But in order to actually effectuate those policies, you need financing and you need projects. So Omar, if you could talk a little bit about DFC, what your work is, and comment on efforts on this issue.
Sure, thanks. And Erin will keep me honest as a former DFCer. So for those of you who aren't familiar with DFC, we're the US government's development finance agency. We're a bank, a development finance institution, and we lend, write equity checks, write political insurance for projects overseas, primarily in emerging markets. We also do a little bit in Europe with regards to energy security, and they're doing a lot on Ukraine at the moment. We're growing very fast. So this year we deployed, this year just gone, a little over $12 billion in new exposure. And that's almost doubling from the $6.7 billion we did in FY 2021. So we're really proud of that quick growth and of the stories behind it. Climate finance within that is about $3.7 billion, which is a 7x or more than a 7x increase from the less than $500 million we did in 2021. So not only are we growing the top line, we're growing the climate finance within that, and that's very important. So examples of some of the projects that we've supported this year are a $126 million loan to a geothermal project in Indonesia, a $350 million commitment to finance a gigawatt of new clean energy in Turkey. And we're looking to do more of these sorts of projects. We're doing a lot, of course, also in debt for nature swaps and adaptation and other transactions across the board. So this is all good, it's important. But in order to meet our mitigation goals, we need to do at least 3 more things on the energy side. So first of all, as Joseph mentioned, we need to bring a lot more capital into this space. And while government is often thought of as the big important wall of money, actually that's the private sector who bring the scale. So in order to bring the private sector along to emerging markets, we need to bring managers who are familiar and who are trusted by the large sources of institutional capital who generally don't allocate to emerging markets. So to that end, DFC this year made a $50 million commitment to a Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners fund. CIP are well known. They do a lot of large wind and clean energy projects in the global north. They're now looking towards the global south, towards projects in countries such as India, in Southeast Asia, South America. We need more of that because they will bring the large limited partners, the LPs, the pension funds who are currently focused on developed markets to emerging markets. That's one, more capital. 2 is, as Narayan was mentioning, we need to make sure that local populations have skin in the game. The just transition is really important here. So as an example, Indian Railways is the second biggest employer in India. 1/3 of Indian Railways revenue is coal freight. So that shows a little bit the political, the economic, the social linkages to hydrocarbons, to fossil fuels that exist not just in India, but around the world, in Indonesia, in South Africa, and here at home. So how do you create a situation where we can support our partners in building new industries with local innovation and local manufacturing? We're never going to replace jobs one for one. That's not what we're trying to do. We take away a coal job, we add a solar panel manufacturing job, but some of that is going to be important, and it will be more important in some markets rather than others. So the booming Indian solar manufacturing sector, into which DFC has deployed almost $1 billion, is a really good example of that. It's often spoke about from the point of view of being important from a supply chain diversification and security point of view. It's also important from a just and politically viable transition point of view. So that's 2. And then 3, we need to bring new technologies to scale. So the IEA say that we have about 2/3 of the technologies we'll need for net zero already commercialized. That's great. That leaves another 1/3 that we need to commercialize, and the Department of Energy and US companies such as First Solar, whose overseas expansion DFC is supporting, are part of that. But even of the commercial technologies, we still need to scale. We need to scale those and bring them to scale. And that is not always the case, and it's especially not always the case in emerging markets. And what enables that is successful project development. So to give you an example, a 1% bump in the cost of capital for a green hydrogen project increases overall project cost by something around 10%. So we need cheap capital. In order to have cheap capital, you need low-risk projects. For low-risk projects, you need high-quality project development. And for that, you need firm revenue, you need stable offtake, you need stable regulatory structures, and you need reps on the board. So that is important not just for green hydrogen, it's important for critical minerals, it's important for energy storage, it's important for direct air capture, it's important for all of these projects that we need to bring to scale. So that's just a few points around how DFC is looking at this more broadly, and really looking forward to this discussion.
So I'll ask you the first round of questions and then relinquish my reign of terror over to Joseph. So Narayan, I'll start with you. You talked about this global arms race in terms of policy. Growing up in the shadow of the Cold War, I'd rather have an arms race about, or policies race about how do we answer these very critical questions about decarbonization and addressing the effects of climate change. But when we're thinking about this energy transition and trying to mitigate the effects of climate change, get our infrastructure up to snuff, that's trillions of dollars in terms of accomplishing this. So we each have our industrial policies, but certainly we have to link these up somehow. So how do you start getting folks to work together, countries to kind of work towards the same goal? We talk about competition as well. So that push-pull and that tension of protectionism. So how would you describe multilateral coordination? What would you like to see?
That's a great question, because this is, I think, at the heart of the problem right now, right? It's a be careful what you wish for situation. We have this proliferation of clean energy industrial policies, which is a great thing in and of itself. But I think we are now at the stage where these policies are starting to mature, and we can actually see where they're perhaps redundant, or where we need to deconflict, or where they can be truly complementary. Another piece of this is market harmonization. There are going to be industries, technologies where one country or jurisdiction is going to have a comparative advantage in terms of manufacturing potential, resource potential, labor potential, you name it. And it makes sense to cite things there, right? So it does not make sense for any one country to do everything everywhere all at once across clean energy. And I think we recognize that. And even all the clean energy manufacturing that's happening in the US is inherently good and will help perhaps serve the US demand. But that's not necessarily all going to be technology that can be exported abroad. But in some cases it might be, and we need to make sure that we are facilitating the right export opportunities for US technology, be it through market harmonization, using levers like the Export-Import Bank, DFC, USAID. Like we have many, USTDA, Commerce ITA, right? We have so many tools of the US government to really make sure that we can help, at least from the US side, make sure that these technologies can mature and find their way abroad. But then there is this broader macro question of how do we work with our allies and partners to really make sure that our policies are not in conflict with each other. So what are we doing right now? Since the IRA passed, there have been a series of bilateral dialogues we've had. We've had bilateral dialogues with the Europeans, with the Japanese, with the Australians. The great thing about the IRA is pretty much clean energy at large has been elevated in every bilateral conversation, right? When the president is pretty much meeting with any major ally or partner, energy is in that conversation. So that is a really good thing. That means that we are able to really make sure that a foreign policy is really being used to advance, the goal of the clean energy, the ultimate goal of the clean energy transition. And then at the working level, our agencies are actually talking to other agencies among our allies and partners. Just with Brazil, we have about 6 to 7 different department and agency-led efforts. There's many projects that DFC is financing, but the Department of Energy has a U.S.-Brazil Energy Forum. Commerce leads an clean energy industry dialogue. Commerce ITA has a number of efforts. And that's just Brazil, right? Similarly, with India, we have a number of different efforts. With Australia, we have efforts. So what needs to happen next is we need to multilateralize those efforts a little bit more. And we're starting to do that. We're starting to figure out, with among these bilateral partnerships, there's a couple of key themes that come up, right? For example, in the critical mineral space, price volatility, depressed prices in critical minerals is a problem that a number of our allies and partners face, as well as us, as our projects are getting off the ground. So there are ways to work together, perhaps on the demand side, perhaps on trade side. For example, Jake Sullivan yesterday in his second speech on industrial policy at Brookings talked about the need for setting up a critical minerals, a high standards marketplace. So these are ways in which we can work multilaterally to make sure that the markets are also, the market conditions are there for us to work multilaterally and really lean in to where each one of us have, comparative advantages across different supply chains. And that's just one example, but I'll leave you with that for now.
Can I jump in and actually ask you to dig in a little bit there? Because, if you start drawing a large matrix, right? Okay, well, the U.S. might have some comparative advantages across a few technologies. We've got countries around the world. You end up with just a total mess, right? So I think this sort of push toward multilateralism is actually really important. How do you see it evolving, right? Is it going to be sectoral, which I think we just heard a little bit on the mineral side. You could imagine sectoral agreements focused on green hydrogen or on carbon capture or on batteries or whatever. Is it going to be sort of coalitions of the willing, like the IPEF was, I think, designed to be? How do you see that working functionally?
I imagine it would be both, all of the options. And what I mean by that is sectorally, there are going to be acute trade issues that we're going to have to work out with key allies and partners. But we have to keep the big picture in mind of how are we doing on industrial decarb, or working together to make sure that the multilateral development banks are helping finance industrial decarbonization projects, like the Clean Technology Fund at the World Bank just recently announced an industrial decarb window. And then there's opportunities for us to work together with G7 partners to help developing countries tap those pots of money. So it's going to have to be many different efforts happening at once. And this is where I feel like, the UNFCCC and the COP kind of helps keep us honest with the global stock takes, raising ambition over time. But then you're going to have, sectoral commitments, sectoral agreements, sectoral cooperation. And then the other thing that I think ultimately keeps us honest is having neutral, arbiters or, analytical foundations like the IEA. And the IEA has done excellent work on this. Just last year in the fall, they released their Energy Technology Perspectives report, a great report which actually gets in to the nitty-gritty of every technology vertical and where the supply chain, where we are capacity-wise out to 2030, out to 2050, and mapping that back onto a 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectory. And what the IEA's work is doing is not just showing where we have gaps, literal gaps, but also showing where we need to bring down cost curves, but also figuring out where we need to diversify those supply chains. So it's not enough to just say, we have 4x the amount of electrolyzer manufacturing capacity that we need, but also recognizing that there might be over-concentration in certain markets and figuring it. And that's where those kind of multilateral efforts, I think, are important. And so using a neutral arbiter or an analytical tool like what the IEA provides is very important, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that IEA also has done some of the best work thinking about what are the shape of these supply chains and distribution. But even in their documents, there's tension, right? There's because you read the World Energy Outlook, and the story it tells about solar is remarkably positive. The incredible 90% cost declines, hyper concentrated in China. And now we have this overcapacity in China that no one is quite sure what to do with. We make more solar panels than the world can apparently deploy. I sense there even a tension with the themes that I'm hearing that we're talking about at the start, which is actually countries are trying to capture parts of these value chains. The alignment between security and economic imperatives is incentivizing climate action. I think this is why I think the resolving those tensions is a really important part of this growing multilateralism.
Totally. There's going to be inherent tension until the very end of this. And I think it's actually a good thing because...
Probably thereafter too.
Right, and thereafter, I'm sure. It's a good thing because the reality is changing right in front of us, right? 10 years ago, the picture in solar was different, very different from where it is right now. In batteries, just 5 years ago, it's very different from where it is now. In hydrogen, who knows where it's going to be in 5 years. So the IEA is naturally always going to, hedge a little bit because that's their job. They're analysts that are going to tell you it could end up this way, it could end up that way. And that's why you also need to have nimble multilateral mechanisms and bilateral partnerships that can kind of adapt based on the new information we learn.
Right.
If we just lock in, certain governance structures sectorally or, getting ourselves dependent on a single technology, we can undercut our overarching goals. So I think there being tension, there being some dynamism, and everything not seeming like it's figured out is actually a good thing, if you ask me.
Building nimbleness into MDBs and financing agencies, I think that's a bit to ask, but but it is true. I mean, DFC, I think, is more nimble than most, but probably not as fast as people would like. And so what I think differentiates DFC from the other agencies out there is that, or at least among U.S. financing agencies, that it fundamentally finances private sector projects overseas. This is not in public infrastructure. There really has to be a private sector component. But we're talking about these projects in emerging economies, risky economies. And so trying to mobilize that private sector capital is really part and parcel of a lot of these initiatives, these legislations. We're seeing it in the CHIPS Act and IRA, and the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. So Amar, to you, with that, what are the other commercial and financing barriers that DFC is running into? And what would you, if you had a magic wand, what could you wave to say, we're going to be nimble. We're going to delve into these projects. We'll be able to switch to hydrogen from solar. What are those barriers that DFC is facing?
So you need a few different things to come together. First, in order to sort of deploy these technologies, you need demand for them. So you need a demand environment. So if you want to deploy long duration energy storage, you need someone to pay for it. That means that you require the regulatory environment, the policy environment to pay for ancillary services. And DOE, USAID's Power Africa program, the State Department, those are all really important tools that the US government can deploy to help build that regulatory and policy environment. Often we're asked to deploy financing, but there is no project, and there is no project because there's no one to pay for the offtake. So you have to first start with the revenue. But even when you have that demand, the shape of it is really key. So I'll give you an example for some projects that we're looking at in green hydrogen in Latin America. The green hydrogen would be used for production of green ammonia for fertilizer. That's great. You already have the demand. People already use green ammonia for fertilizer, already use gray ammonia for fertilizer, but the chemical is the same. You're just buying ammonia. It makes economic sense because the gray hydrogen that you currently are using in Latin America is generally shipped from Europe, often using Russian gas. The price is volatile. You have to ship it a long way. You have to bring it inland. By the time you do that, green hydrogen and green ammonia is actually cost competitive. What is the problem you then face? The problem is that farmers buy fertilizer on the spot market. They don't sign long-term offtake contracts for it. And even if they did, they're not credit-worthy counterparties, so the contract wouldn't be worth that much. DFIs and large financing agencies, if we're going to back this project, sort of large-scale project development, often want long-term offtake contracts. That's how people think. That's what the shape of the market is like. So we then need to think creatively. How can we work with the end buyers of these farmers' output, with the Krafts and the Nestle's and these sorts of companies, to create sort of longer-term offtake contracts, which are of benefit to them perhaps because it provides price stability? Or how can the financing agencies also begin to take a little bit more risk and lean in on some of this merchant exposure? So a lot of this comes down to project development, and that's a second point from the companies themselves. So many companies that produce these new technologies are basically venture-backed. They're move fast, break things, iterate. That's really good for developing new technology. It's really bad for project development. Like, you do not want to break things when you're developing projects. So that requires a mindset shift. how can we take long duration energy storage technology from the lab or from the first commercial scale demo project and be like, okay, we're going to now take this really exciting thing and we're going to make it as boring as possible and deploy it really well and allocate those risks. That's not easy to do. These companies aren't set up to do that. And there's not a ton of people actually helping them. For those of you who are interested, I would recommend you check out an organization called Mark I, which is here in the United States. It's spun out of RMI's Third Derivative and Deep Science Ventures. It's run by a guy called Julian Ruber-White, who is a former solar developer and a very deep thinker on this sort of issue. They're essentially a developer as a service model and trying to help bring some of these tech companies to project development. Right. But those are sort of some of the biggest issues that we face with actually deploying these technologies overseas, the revenue shape, the market, and then the actual expertise and knowledge of how to develop a project.
Yeah, on that project development question, we are developing a ton of new tools here in the United States to help on every piece of the innovation chain, right? We've got the Office of Clean Energy demonstration. We've got the Loan Programs Office. Do we need analogs in government, or can those tools be applied to some of the challenges that you guys are facing and the firms you're working with are facing? Right? It feels like there is a lot of capacity here that could be put to use.
I think it's a really good question. I think it depends partially on where is this technology going to be commercialized first.
Right.
If it's something like green hydrogen, where you have the hydrogen hubs in the United States, where we're in a position to get this technology de-risked and deployed at commercial scale, that becomes less necessary.
Yeah.
If it's something else, though, where if it's, for instance, direct air capture, where Kenya and Iceland are countries that really make a ton of sense for this, because they have access to really low-cost baseload clean energy, they have access to basalt in their geology where you can store the carbon dioxide, then yes, maybe this starts to become more of the answer that we need to commercialize these first overseas.
Yep.
Critical minerals is a whole different area that Narayan is much more deeply knowledgeable about than I am. But yeah.
So, and kind of taking a step back, Joseph brought up the overcapacity issue with China, and I think that we're looking at that in a range of areas, including EVs, but also in other types of products they manufacture. But Narayan, I'll pose this question to you, and Omar, if you want to jump in. They've certainly dominated when it's come to solar panels, and now if we have more solar panels, then we know what to do. What sort of innovation should we be thinking? Where does our policy help push that technological and innovative drive to maybe have us corner some part of the market, whether it's hydrogen or wind? Where can we start getting ahead of things? And is that part of our environmental industrial policy?
So I think the way the IRA is built, it's tech neutral, right? And even the production investment tax credits, everything is moving in a neutral direction. And I think that's actually inherently a good thing, because U.S. innovation is always served best when we create the conditions, we incentivize the conditions for innovation, and then award people for outcomes, right? So if you look at the 45X tax credit again, it's chemistry neutral when it's providing a tax credit for cell manufacturing or pack manufacturing. And same with the solar and wind value chains as well under 45X. So that's a good thing. That means the room for innovation is built in. And then on top of that, you're then providing grant and loan authorities to the agencies to go help those nascent technologies get commercialized. One example of this, just taking the battery supply chain, for example. So you have the 45X tax credit that's providing, incentives along the value chain. You have the Office of Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chains at DOE providing a grant for a company like Sila Nanotechnologies, which is also an ARPA-E grantee from a couple of years prior to that. And it's a silicon anode company. So this is pretty much, it's innovative technology. It's helping produce the next generation of batteries, getting away from graphite anodes, and graphite is particularly a vulnerable critical mineral. So in some cases, the innovation could also be driven by security issues, also just lack of supply chain diversification issues and whatnot. So we see Sila, ramping up. Sila has offtake agreements with major OEMs and whatnot, and then the 45X tax credit is also going to help them, right? So it's a great example of how the policy environment and the conditions are there for nascent companies to kind of get through the various TRL levels to finally get commercialized. And then the question is, how do you then make it boring enough such that Omar and DFC can go help finance a silicon anode manufacturing plant in another country now that it's been proven at scale here in the US. And this is why I think the BIL and IRA are so important, because we really have to, pull those technologies through that last mile to commercialization, and then do it a couple more times, enough such that DFC, when DFC is diligencing that project, there's no technology risk at that point, and you're just thinking about financing risk. And then we do have to figure out the demand side, and there's various ways in which that's kind of also being figured out. But I do think there's a lot of and I'm sure there's a lot of other good ideas out there of how we can continue to push forward technology innovation in this space. But I really fundamentally do think the conditions are there.
Sure, Omar.
And just to come in on that point, so this also gets, I think, to what Narayan was talking about before, about the importance of working with our partners overseas in a multilateral way, but from quite early on. So as an example, our deputy CEO was just in India. A large part of what she was over there to do was to talk about clean energy manufacturing and how can we support solar and battery companies over there. Spoke to a lot of each. The battery cell manufacturing industry in India is currently growing very fast because of Indian production-linked incentive, PLI incentives for those cell manufacturers. Within that incentive system is a requirement for a lot of domestic value add. So the cell manufacturers have announced projects. Ola, Amara Raja, Reliance, they're all announcing cell projects. But other companies further down in the supply chain are also now looking at scaling projects on anode and cathode manufacturing, on electrolyte production. Some of these companies have indigenously developed technology from the Indian government that they're now deploying. However, when they go to the cell manufacturers to qualify their products, the cell manufacturers are often using PRC-derived technology, which then requires the rest of the supply chain to get on that same technology platform in order to qualify their products and have it be relevant to the rest of the supply chain. So that's a real challenge. If we engage early in the process, if we're sharing technology very proactively, if we're agreeing on a set of standards in a multilateral way, that helps to pull the rest of our allies and our partners into the US system onto a common platform that not only improves supply chain diversity and security, but also makes it easier for them to link into our trade networks, which is a really sort of positive sum outcome.
Yeah, I think really interesting. One thing I wonder how you guys think about this, probably keeps you up at night, is like, how do we look at comparative advantage? You've got limited resources. You've got limited amounts of money. You've got limited amounts of time, right? And so, as you think about the innovations you expect to see out of the bipartisan infrastructure law, places where the U.S. seems particularly capable of innovation, how do we steer our efforts? How do we avoid sunk costs, right? And how do we sort of try and carve out an area where we're going to be really competitive? Is that a tech question? Is it a modality question? How do you guys think about that?
I guess I could start. Not to reject the premise of your question, but I will.
That's fine. This is what a think tank's for.
Even while we're in the throes of industrial policy, and everyone loves talking about industrial policy, including me, the foundation of all this is the belief, at least in the United States, that this is going to be private sector-led, government-enabled. You've probably heard many people say that in the US government. And the reason is because that's how the BIL and IRA have fundamentally been set up. We are not actively preferring one technology or one battery chemistry or anything like that. We are creating the conditions. I mean, broadly speaking, we know we need to deploy, clean energy. We need to decarbonize the industrial sector. We need to electrify and decarbonize the transportation sector. So we have these broad goals, and then we have a bunch of different, loan and grant programs plus tax credits that are helping create the conditions for companies to invest, right? And once technologies get mature, they get out of the lab, they get demonstrated, they get scaled up, they get commercialized. Then we have tools like DFC and XIM and USAID and TDA and ITA and all these things to then push that out to the rest of the world. I think that's when the United States is doing best. It's not when the government is trying to figure out which battery chemistry should succeed or where we should double down. We let that happen organically, and then once we know what's working, then we go and export that out or make that more accessible to the rest of the world. I think that's how this works best within our system. I think we're already starting to see the fruits of that. Look at what DFC is doing with some of these forced solar projects overseas. Those are good examples. So yeah, not to not answer the question, but I think there's a different way of looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, but even then, what are I guess I'm trying to understand, like, what are the indicators you're looking for when you're, is it private sector, is it companies coming in and saying, hey, we actually think that we've got a longstanding, we reported a lot on the first solar case, so use that one. We've got longstanding relationships in India. We've got a technology which will offer diversification. We know that there's a set of industrial policies there that benefit domestic manufacturing. Like so that sort of sets up the conditions to move. What I'm puzzling over is like, okay, how do we then apply that to a lot of the other places where the U.S. has a distinct technological pathway, or has followed one, or firms that have done that? That's where I'm not saying we're like not imposing market discipline. Yeah. I'm just saying, like, what are the indicators we should look for?
So I think the indicators are ultimately looking at project success in the United States, right? Yeah. So the projects that have been sufficiently technologically de-risked, have found off-takers, have figured out the demand question, have gotten financed, have broken ground, have then started, pushing product out. Those projects, those become success stories. Success begets success. Then that same company may have an opportunity to take a similar project overseas to meet a different market demand. And that's where I think DFC and XIM and other parts of the US government can come in and say, well, we know that worked here, and we're familiar with that company. That company also now has a balance sheet, right? And things start kind of organically happening at that point. Maybe this is a little sanguine on my part, but I do think it's really early to exactly pinpoint the successes of the BIL and IRA when it comes to certain technologies. These projects are just getting off the ground. We're seeing early successes, but it's still too early to tell what are real export opportunities or things we should be leaning into. It could be heat pumps, it could be solar, it could be certain battery chemistries, it could be industrial decarb technologies, it could be all of the above, and that would be really exciting. Yeah. And even a subset of that would be really exciting.
So we have asked plenty of questions, and audience, you're not off the hook. You get to participate as well. So folks, if you have any questions for our panelists, please raise your hand. We have microphones being passed around. If not, our reign of terror continues. Anybody? Yes, up here.
Just remember to identify yourself, where you're representing, and questions have a brief prepositional statement and then go up at the end.
Thank you. Chase Winner from Energy Intelligence. One question I have is, I'm not as familiar with DFC, so maybe you can clarify a little bit. But the EXIM Bank is funding fossil fuel projects despite executive orders against that, and there's reasons for that, right? And then you have Sullivan the other day mentioned that the EXIM Bank, DFC, and AGO are up for renewal next year, and so I'm kind of wondering how you're viewing that renewal, and as far as like what you can do with fossil fuel funding, and will it be like a bigger push on the green energy side? Second question, if I can, China's obviously a big leader in the renewable space. I'm just wondering if you see sort of like a global bifurcation where they're competing for these export markets when the U.S. isn't quite an exporter yet, like China is. But do you see sort of, I don't know, a green Cold War or a global bifurcation on these issues?
Sure. So on DFC reauthorization, we are up for reauthorization next year from Congress. We're excited about that process. We're working with Congress, and the administration has put forward a proposed update. And we think that it's a great opportunity to strengthen some of the best parts about DFC, including our equity authority, which is a very valuable tool that we have to take forward-leaning bets on companies that are strategically important for the United States. An example is TechMet, which is an equity investee of DFC, which develops and processes critical mineral resources around the world. So we're excited about that process, and we expect it to go well. On hydrocarbons, we don't take a view on different technologies. We are private sector driven. So when the private sector comes to us with applications for our funding, we take those, we look at them in the same way across the board. We look at them on the basis of commercial characteristics and how they meet sort of policy, environmental and social requirements, etc. We have financed gas projects in Eastern Europe from an energy security point of view. I think it's important that we also are aware that energy security can be delivered with clean energy because you're not reliant on fuel inputs, but we will continue to do hydrocarbon projects overseas where our partners demand it. On your other question, and I'm sure Narayan has a view on this as well, as Jake Sullivan has said, the approach of a small yard and high fence is important. So we work with all countries in meeting some of our critical challenges, including climate. Delivering solar projects, for instance, in emerging markets requires everyone to come together to do that. What is really important, though, is that we have a diversified supply chain, that we have fair competition, that people are competing on a level playing field, and DFC makes sure that in our projects we're helping our allies to build manufacturing at home where that is important for them, to support US or allied companies wherever possible, and that tenders, for instance, for our projects are open and competitive. But I don't know if you have...
The only thing I would add to that is just emphasizing the point that the way in which our development finance tools work is really adding to local beneficiation, making that a key pillar of any projects we finance abroad. That is also that is one of our comparative advantages when it comes to our development finance approach, and it's something that we absolutely should lean into more. One thing I'm gonna throw this back to Omar for a second. I think the TechMet example that he mentioned is a really good one because it's an example where DFC is moving away from just single project financings to putting money into funds and platforms that can do multiple of the same kind of projects. So you're essentially leaning on expertise of these fund managers, which I think can take a little bit of pressure or stress off DFC so it can look more widely across the world and invest in other sectors as well. I do think it's worth saying a few more lines on that because it's a huge success story.
Yeah, so TechMet is fantastic. So there's a couple of things that are useful about this. One is what Narayan said, which is that they can move faster, they can be nimble. So TechMet, for instance, has developed a rare earths project in Palabora in South Africa, which is a region that had historically been very reliant on coal generation for employment. Is now taking very rare earths elements from a waste tailings mine, processing that, and exporting it, creating sort of a secure and diversified supply for that. Is also looking at projects in Brazil on nickel, and multiple other projects around the world. So we're really proud of that. It also gets to a piece that we raised at the beginning, which is that by supporting TechMet, we're also drawing in other capital to build and diversify the supply chain. So our partners in Qatar recently made another investment into TechMet. That is a positive story. That is a global platform that will provide critical mineral supply in a way that is secure.
And do you think that, do you see that as an emerging trend? I mean, you also talked about the Copenhagen Investment Fund and its activities looking more broadly into South Asia and the global South writ large. Should we look for more of that activity? And do you think that's a good way for DFC to sort of make interventions without having to go project by project by project?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we need to do more of both, right? It's all of the above. We need to do more direct investment. We also need to do more direct funds. The direct investment is important because it enables us to do, really challenging projects.
Right.
It enables the U.S. government to have, a direct impact on the ground, which is important for many different reasons, and allows us to really select those individual projects that, as Narayan was mentioning, support what we think is a key part of development, which is supporting the local private sector, standing behind local companies and local entrepreneurs to develop their own markets, as opposed to a state-led investment model. So we're going to do more direct, but we also want to do more through funds for all of the reasons that we've just mentioned. Our ability to do that will be a little bit dependent on reauthorization. At the moment, we deploy about $500 million a year of equity, more or less. That's because it's very expensive for us to do under current government accounting rules. We hope to be unleashed to run out and do more, really thoughtful and strategic projects. And we're working with the Hill and the administration to allow us to do that.
So shameless plug for CSIS products. There is one report on the equity financing issue if you want to learn more about that. And my former program and also the Project on Prosperity and Development has done a series of ideas for the DFC in its reauthorization, which I'm sure they definitely have taken all of those recommendations on board. Any other questions? I think we have time for one or two more. Yeah, in the back.
Thank you. I'm David Paolella from Breakthrough Energy, and my question is about coordination of all the different tools that we're talking about here within the U.S. government. It seems like DFC probably sits near the end of what could be a sequence of tools that start with like market development and project origination all the way to deployment. And I'm wondering how you see the coordination of those tools and the sequencing playing out now, and how you might see them being more coordinated in the future if you see that as necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. Omar's heard me talk a lot about this within government. So there's a lot of work to be done to further coordinate these tools. And I love the way you laid that out, because there is, kind of a spectrum of where every, agency or part of the U.S. government can fit in. What I think is an interesting trend that you're already seeing is USAID, for example, is really leaning into supply chain work and really trying to help develop strategies for supply chain work in the various countries that they work in, explicitly with the idea of then setting them up to start developing a project plan and idea that eventually can be financed by another part of either the U.S. government or a multilateral development bank. There are a lot of opportunities. I think this is one of the most untapped areas for us, and something that we're really trying to lean into. And the benefit of having the BIL and IRA is, as these projects get up and running, we're going to also have a better sense of what the markets look like, how these projects are doing. This is like really good market information. And so one of the things I am trying to facilitate within the U.S. government is just the information sharing among our agencies of, if the Department of Energy has all this information on cost curves for different technologies, that's information that can be shared with our DFC partners, with USAID, with other parts of the U.S. government. That ultimately informs project development. It also can help inform even questions around what are we pegging the price of this thing to, or that to. That's very, very important, because ultimately, beyond the technology challenge, we have a fundamental project finance challenge that we have to get over. And I'm sure we're going to think of innovative ways of solving the project finance issue through different forms of demand side support and stuff like that. But we have to really bring in all these other arms of the U.S. government that I think have been kind of operating in a siloed way for many, many years. Not for a bad reason. They've all had different functions, but we haven't had as much focus in a sector as we do right now. And we have all these domestic tools that are also having overseas impacts. We're not going to be able to manufacture all the solar modules that have been, or the module manufacturing capacity that's announced without importing some level of ingots and wafers. That's just going to be a reality. We're not going to be able to process all the material, battery material that we need without importing some level of that. That means we're going to need to help build these projects overseas or source them from allied and friendly countries. And so that's where these tools can also help us, help cite those projects, make sure that there's local beneficiation, and then, build a broader supply chain that our other allies and partners can also benefit from. So this is, I think, it's what keeps me up at night in a very good way. I think there's a lot of good thought leadership to be done too on this topic.
But there's certainly plenty of tools where it fits all along the different stages of a project lifecycle, including building the enabling environment, doing the feasibility studies. TDA, big plug for them. They're an agency that punches way above their weight. But yeah, DFC is kind of the lender of last resort, but one of the most important ones. Omar, you had a comment.
Yeah, I was just going to very briefly. So Narayan's being a little bit modest in this because he's really sort of the leader in our space in making sure this coordination works better. And your question is really important. Like the focus and the internal coordination is really, really critical to making these different arms of the U.S. government work even more effectively together. It's an area of opportunity for us. I'm very optimistic that we'll continue to be better and improve at it. But it's really fundamental to making the rest of this work. So I just wanted to underscore your point.
So we are at time. And I'm not going to get between this audience and a reception, but I'm going to give Joseph the last word.
I'd like to thank our guests, advertise some of our own work, both past and upcoming, as we're looking at sort of, some of the successes from the IRA with respect to funding for carbon management, advanced nuclear energy. We're thinking about how do we get those onto the field internationally, and we'll have some work on that issue coming out relatively soon. So very grateful that you guys came here today. Grateful that you're leading this work, and really happy that we were all here. Hope you have a nice reception afterward.
Thank you, everyone.